When people meet Bill for the first time, they usually think that he is a generic white male with a common haircut, standing about 5'9". Those features might describe a boring man, and in this case, they do. Those who meet Bill have gone so far as to say he is the most boring man they have ever met. Now, you might think that the story of a man turned zombie and thrust into the parahuman underworld might be exciting, riveting, and full of danger. Well, I can assure you that this is not that story. Bill was driving his tan 1998 Honda Accord back from work on November 19th, 2018, when his whole life changed. Or at least he thought that it would change. He saw a white pickup truck pulled over on the side of a two-lane country road. He thought this was odd because there weren't any buildings for miles, and the forests of his hometown in Hitler, Georgia, were quite expansive. He always thought that the name of his hometown was as unfortunate as his own. Bill was feeling exceptionally daring this night, so he pulled over to see if there was someone who needed his help. As his car pulled to a stop behind the truck, he saw a light in the corner of his vision. He looked out into the woods to see the light of a fire about 100 yards from the side of the road. As Bill left his car to go see what this fire was all about, he couldn't help but remark on how unlike himself he was acting. Usually he was more concerned with getting home to his 5 cats, and would never leave to creep into the dark with a menacing woods lurking around. As Bill got closer to the fire, he could see that there was a man by the fire, dancing like how he thought Native American tribes used to when trying to summon rain. Just as he thought the crazed man would be able to see him in his hiding spot, Bill's vision went black. Looking back on the night Bill died should make him feel pain or even anger, but Bill mostly just regretted stepping out of his routine. When Bill awoke, he came to find that the dancing man was a necromancer. The reason he blacked out was because one of his zombies hit him over the head with a rather large log, and Bill was now dead. Yes, he still breathed, walked around, talked, and did most everything he did when he was alive, but he did not have a heartbeat, and his skin had a pale gray color to it. It astounded him how much his unlife was similar to that of his life. Anyways, the necromancer behaved much like you would expect any necromancer to behave. Megalomania, desire to gain vast amounts of power and minions, a horrific tendency to ruin fellow mages' dinner parties by bringing the newly raised host's relatives as his dinner guests. At one of these dinner parties, Bill was told to wait in the van, as usual, and it seemed like it would turn into a normal Friday night. The host, as one would expect, took his dead aunt as the necromancer's guest in a very bad way. Through the windows of the necromancer's van, Bill saw flashes of light and windows blowing out, and thought he would go check on his creator if he hadn't explicitly told Bill to stay in the van. Bill stayed there until police lights came 30 minutes later. This is how Bill ended up here, at the Parahuman Agency, or PHA for short. We know how Bill came to be at the PHA, or the Parahuman Association. We also know how he became a zombie. Now we can dive deep into the meat of this podcast. So the characters, in the first episode, Bill's at the PHA, and he meets his new boss, Amanda. And there's a conversation that ensues. I don't want to spoil that for anyone, but Amanda becomes one of the main characters, and she'll pop up throughout each of the episodes. From there on, each episode has a new character that Bill and the audience are introduced to. So in episode 2, Bill meets with a vampire named Josh, and Josh understandably has love issues as he's a vampire and trying to date mortal women. In episode 3, Bill's session is with a ghost, Jose. Jose haunts his murderer, but he's starting to get bored of all this haunting stuff. Lastly, in episode 4, Bill meets with a Cerebus, and the head of the Cerebus, the heads of those are named Finn, Missy, and Ollie. They're having family issues, so to speak. and Bill needs to help settle things between them. So the intended audience for this podcast is really for those podcast listeners who like sci-fi and fantasy audio dramas. And now that has been something that's been gaining in popularity in the last few years. And lately I've just seen more and more podcasts like that out and about. Wolverine, Marvel just made a podcast called Wolverine: The Long Night, and then a second season as well, and that one's taking off. Marvel made a partnership with Stitcher, and they made that together. Part of my inspiration for this was a book series called Fred the Vampire Accountant, and he's kind of like a boring accountant person who gets turned into a vampire, and his life isn't that much different than it was before, except he makes all these new friends and kind of has the life that he wanted when he was still alive. So I'm kind of taking that boring person Fred from that and making him into a Bill for my purposes. It's mixed also with the Bright Sessions. The Bright Sessions is a podcast that's about a therapist who sees people with parahuman or abnormal abilities. That one's more geared towards like superheroes and superpowers. Mine is more geared towards people who are dead or parahumans, vampires, zombies, mythological creatures, things of that sort. And then lastly, I took some inspiration also from the series of Unfortunate Events, because I want it to kind of have that feel, kind of like dark, dreary, but at the same time entertaining and you can't look away. And also a little bit of humor mixed in as well. I want people to be able to laugh about it. So this story will be told as both an audio drama and case files or informational texts that are posted on the website as well. The podcast is an audio drama, so there will be sound effects and different voices for the different characters in the story. Each episode will involve the main character, Bill Smith, and his new characters or clients. These case files will be documents that make up that client's file and an animated picture of that client as well. So you can get most of the information on the podcast about what happened during that session, but then you also get additional information in the case file and follow-up session. So in the podcast, there's only one session per client, but in the case file, you see all the other sessions that Bill has also had with them, and maybe their story progresses a little bit. Maybe the vampire does find love, maybe the ghost isn't bored anymore with haunting, or he finds something else to do with his time, and that can be found out on the website. So the viewer who wants to dive fully into the Transmedia experience, they're going to be listening to the podcast when it comes out, and then after they listen to it, going on the website to read more about what happened during that session, and then maybe look at some follow-up sessions as well if Bill had any follow-up sessions with them. Someone who's just a podcast listener and not into reading stories, they'll just listen to the podcast, and they can have a full experience doing that. Someone who's just interested in web serials or bloggers and blog posts, they might just go on the website and read those case files and look at the images and kind of have imagination about what else goes on. So either route you take, you can have a full experience with the Transmedia story. I kind of took inspiration from the Bright Sessions on how they did their Transmedia experience with this, because they have the sessions on with the therapist and the person with superpowers on the podcast, and that's more than enough of an experience. That's what I've done for most of the time I've listened to that podcast. But they also, if you donate to Patreon, they release more episodes and follow-up sessions with that person as a podcast file. So that's kind of how I took the inspiration of the main session on the podcast, but then you have more information and more sessions you can learn about through other means as well. So the way that I want people to stay engaged with it, other than listening to the podcast and going on the website and reading more about the sessions, is I want them to be able to recommend what other clients Bill Smith will come into contact with. So similar to the podcast called Crime Junkies, and that podcast, viewers in the audience can suggest what the podcast hosters should cover in the next several weeks. So they'll recommend different crime stories in their hometown or crime stories that, you know, they might have seen or been involved with or been questioned about or something like that. And then Crime Junkies will cover those cases after they do the research on them. So in this podcast, I want viewers to be able to say, oh, I liked the Cerebus. You know, I'm super into mythological creatures. Why don't you cover one where he meets with a Greek god, like Zeus is having, you know, family issues or home problems, and he needs Bill to console him, or he's going to start, you know, shooting lightning bolts down from the sky or something. So I want the viewers to be able to suggest different creatures or monsters or gods that they're interested in, and then they'll have some sort of issue that Bill Smith has to meet with them about.